What happens when a single tattoo can change everything? When one glimpse of ink on skin can transform a criminal investigation into something extraordinary. In a world where stolen valor runs rampant and fake military credentials are sold online for a few dollars, one woman's arrest seemed like just another routine case of military impersonation. But sometimes the most shocking truths hide beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman whose life took an unexpected turn when she was handcuffed in a downtown bar, accused of falsely claiming to be a Navy SEAL. What the arresting officers didn't know, what the prosecutors couldn't have imagined, and what would leave a decorated admiral speechless, was that sometimes the most unbelievable stories turn out to be the most true. In an era where heroes are questioned and authenticity is rare, prepare to discover how one moment of recognition changed everything, and how the truth can be more extraordinary than any lie ever told. Sarah Mitchell sat at the corner booth of Murphy's Tavern, nursing her third beer of the evening as rain drummed against the windows. The dim lighting cast shadows across her weathered face, highlighting scars that told stories she rarely shared. At 34, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that commanded respect, even in civilian clothes. The conversation at the next table had been going on for 20 minutes. Three young men in their 20s were bragging loudly about their military service, each story more elaborate than the last. Sarah tried to ignore them, focusing on the amber liquid in her glass, but their claims grew increasingly outrageous. "Yeah, I was a ranger for 6 years." One of them slurred, his words thick with alcohol. "Saw action in Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. Got 3 Purple Hearts." Sarah's jaw tightened. She knew the type. Wannabes who thought military service was just another story to impress people at bars. She had seen too many real soldiers come home broken, too many families destroyed by war, to let this slide. "What unit?" she asked quietly, not turning around. The man's voice faltered slightly. 75th Ranger Regiment." "You wouldn't know it." Sarah finally turned to face them, her green eyes steady and unflinching. "Actually, I would. I spent 8 years in special operations, and there's no way you were a ranger." The bar grew quieter as other patrons sensed the tension building. The young man's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "Who are you to question me? What would some woman know about real combat?" Sarah stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. At 5'6", she wasn't intimidating by size, but something in her posture made the 3 men shift uncomfortably. "I know enough to spot a fraud. Real soldiers don't need to brag about their service to strangers in bars." "Oh yeah? And what makes you such an expert?" The second man jumped up, swaying slightly. "Let me guess, you were some desk jockey in the Air Force." A bitter smile crossed Sarah's lips. "Navy. And I wasn't behind a desk." The first man laughed harshly. "Right. What? You're going to tell us you were a SEAL? That's rich. Women can't even be SEALs." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the familiar weight of secrets, of a life she couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it themselves. The classified operations, the years of training, the sacrifices that had cost her everything she once held dear. "Actually," she said quietly, "that's exactly what I'm telling you." The eruption was immediate. The 3 men burst into laughter, their voices cutting through the bar's atmosphere like knives. Other patrons turned to stare, some chuckling along with the joke they assumed they were hearing. "That's the funniest thing I've heard all night," the first man gasped between laughs. "Lady, I don't know what fantasy you're living in, but women aren't allowed in SEAL teams. Never have been, never will be." Sarah's expression didn't change. She had expected this reaction. It was the same response she got whenever the truth accidentally slipped out. The problem was that technically, officially, these men were right. The Navy's official policy prohibited women from serving in direct combat roles like the SEALs. But Sarah knew something they didn't, that official policies and classified realities weren't always the same thing. "Believe what you want," she said, reaching for her wallet to pay her tab. But the first man wasn't done. His humiliation at being called out had transformed into aggressive determination to expose what he was certain was a lie. You know what? I'm calling bullshit on this. Tom, get your phone out. Let's see if this lady's got the balls to stick to her story when we post it online. Sarah felt the familiar tension in her shoulders that always preceded violence. These weren't combat situations, but her body didn't always remember that. Years of training had wired her to respond to threats with overwhelming force, and alcohol had lowered her usual careful control. "I suggest you let it go," she said, her voice carrying a warning that made several nearby patrons step back instinctively. Instead, the man pulled out his own phone and started recording. "Say it again, lady. Tell everyone how you're a Navy SEAL. Go ahead. Lie to the whole internet." The situation spiraled quickly from there. Within minutes, someone had called the police. Within an hour, Sarah found herself in handcuffs in the back of a patrol car, charged with stolen valor under the Stolen Valor Act of 2013. The law made it a federal crime to fraudulently claim receipt of military decorations or medals, and impersonating special forces was taken particularly seriously. Detective Mike Rodriguez had seen dozens of stolen valor cases in his 12 years with the Richmond Police Department. They usually followed the same pattern. Someone desperate for respect or trying to impress others would claim military service they'd never earned. Most were pathetic rather than malicious, but the law was the law. Sarah sat silently in the interrogation room, her hands folded calmly on the metal table. Rodriguez studied her carefully as he reviewed the complaint. Something about her demeanor struck him as different from the usual suspects. She wasn't defensive or nervous. She wasn't trying to modify her story or backtrack. She just sat there with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. "So, Ms. Mitchell," Rodriguez began, opening his folder. "You want to tell me what happened tonight?" 3 men were claiming military service they clearly never had. I called them out on it. They didn't like being corrected by a woman. Rodriguez nodded. It was a story he'd heard before, usually from the other side. "And you told them you were a Navy SEAL?" "Yes. You understand that's impossible, right? Women aren't allowed in SEAL teams." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "That's what the official policy says." There was something in her tone that made Rodriguez pause. Most people caught in this situation either doubled down with increasingly elaborate lies or broke down and confessed immediately. Sarah Mitchell was doing neither. "Ma'am, I'm trying to help you here. Stolen valor is a serious charge. If you were actually in the military, even in a different capacity, we can work with that. Maybe you got confused about your role, or maybe you just misspoke. But claiming to be a SEAL when you're not, that's going to be hard to walk back from." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Finally, she spoke. "Detective, there are things about military operations that aren't common knowledge. There are programs that don't officially exist. There are people who serve in capacities that can never be acknowledged publicly." Rodriguez had heard conspiracy theories before, but, again, something about Mitchell's delivery was different. She wasn't wild-eyed or desperate. She spoke with the calm certainty of someone stating facts. "Okay, let's say I believe you," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You got any proof? Military ID? Documentation? Anything that would back up this claim?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing I can show you. Not without clearances you don't have." It was exactly the answer Rodriguez expected from someone making up an elaborate story. "Ms. Mitchell, here's where we are. I've got 3 witnesses who say you claim to be a Navy SEAL. I've got video of you making that claim. And I've got no evidence whatsoever that you ever served in any capacity. You're looking at federal charges here. I understand. Do you want a lawyer?" "Not yet." Rodriguez closed his folder and leaned back in his chair. "Look, I've been doing this for 12 years. I've seen every kind of stolen valor case there is. The guy who never served, but wants to feel important. The veteran who exaggerates their service. The complete fraud who makes up everything. You don't fit any of those profiles, which honestly makes this more confusing." Sarah remained silent. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to hold you overnight while we process the paperwork. In the morning, you'll see a federal prosecutor. I strongly suggest you get a lawyer and figure out a better story than secret SEAL program, because that's not going to fly in court." As Rodriguez stood to leave, Sarah spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Detective, when you process this case, Make sure it goes through proper military channels. Have someone with actual clearance review my file. Man, what file? You're not in the system. Sarah's smile was sad, but certain. I'm in a system, just not one you have access to. Rodriguez paused at the door. There was something about her absolute conviction that nagged at him. In his experience, most liars showed tells, nervous gestures, inconsistent stories, attempts to oversell their claims. Sarah Mitchell showed none of these signs. She was either a remarkably skilled liar, or she actually believed what she was saying. One more question, he said. If you really are who you claim to be, why were you drinking alone in a dive bar on a Tuesday night? Why aren't you on some secret mission or training exercise, or whatever it is SEALs do? For the first time since her arrest, Sarah's composed mask slipped slightly. Pain flickered across her features before she regained control. Because sometimes, detective, serving your country costs more than you're prepared to pay. And sometimes the hardest battle isn't against an enemy overseas. It's against the ghosts you bring home with you. The answer was so raw, so honest, that Rodriguez found himself believing it despite all logic. He'd interviewed enough real veterans to recognize the weight of genuine trauma when he heard it. But believing she'd served and believing she'd been a SEAL were two different things entirely. As he left the interrogation room, Rodriguez made a mental note to be thorough with this case. Something about Sarah Mitchell didn't add up, but he couldn't decide if that meant she was lying or telling a truth too classified for him to understand. In her cell that night, Sarah lay on the narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling. She'd known this day would come eventually. Living a normal life after the service she'd given was impossible when that service officially didn't exist. Every casual conversation was a minefield. Every job interview was built on lies of omission. Every relationship was doomed by secrets she could never share. The tattoo on her left shoulder blade itched beneath her shirt, a small trident that marked her as something the world believed was impossible. Tomorrow, she knew, things would get complicated. But tonight, for the first time in months, she didn't have to pretend to be someone else. Tonight, in a jail cell in Richmond, Virginia, Sarah Mitchell could finally be exactly who she was, even if no one believed her. Federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh had built her career on attention to detail and an almost obsessive need to understand every angle of a case before stepping into court. At 42, she had prosecuted dozens of stolen valor cases and had developed a reputation for being thorough but fair. Most cases were straightforward. Embarrassed defendants would plead guilty after being confronted with evidence, accepting reduced sentences in exchange for admitting their deception. The Sarah Mitchell case felt different from the moment the file landed on her desk. Walsh sat in her office at 7 in the morning, reviewing the police report and witness statements. 3 witnesses, video evidence, and a defendant who not only maintained her innocence but seemed genuinely puzzled by the charges against her. Most stolen valor defendants tried to backtrack or modify their claims once arrested. Mitchell had simply repeated her original statement and requested that military personnel review her case. Janet, Walsh called to her assistant, "Can you pull any military records we have on Sarah Mitchell? Date of birth March 15th, 1990, Social Security number." She read off the numbers from the arrest report. 20 minutes later, Janet returned with a puzzled expression. "That's weird, Ms. Walsh. There's no record of a Sarah Mitchell with those details ever serving in any branch of the military. Not in the regular databases, anyway." Walsh frowned. Most stolen valor cases involved people who had either never served or had served in limited capacities but exaggerated their roles. Complete fabrications were rarer and usually came from people with obvious psychological issues. Mitchell's arrest report and Detective Rodriguez's notes suggested a woman who was calm, coherent, and absolutely convinced of her own story. What about arrest records? Prior convictions? Clean. Not even a speeding ticket. She's worked as a security consultant for the past 6 years, owns her own small firm, pays her taxes, no debt, no criminal associations. The profile was growing stranger. Most people who fabricated military service did so for specific reasons, to get jobs, impress romantic partners, or gain social status. Mitchell appeared to have a stable life and career that didn't require military credentials. Get Detective Rodriguez on the phone, Walsh instructed. I want to hear his read on this defendant. Rodriguez arrived at Walsh's office an hour later, carrying a cup of coffee and looking like he hadn't slept well. I'll be honest, Ms. Walsh, this case is bothering me. I've interviewed hundreds of suspects over the years, and Mitchell doesn't fit any profile I recognize. Explain. Rodriguez settled into the chair across from Walsh's desk. Most liars, especially ones caught red-handed, show stress responses. They fidget, they modify their stories, they try to negotiate or explain away inconsistencies. Mitchell did none of that. She was calm, consistent, and seemed genuinely surprised that we couldn't verify her service record. Walsh made notes as he spoke. Any chance she's delusional? Mental health issues. That's what I thought at first, but no. She's completely lucid, coherent, responsive to questions. She's not living in a fantasy world. She just claims to have served in a capacity that officially doesn't exist. And you believe her? Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. I believe she believes it. Whether that makes her delusional or whether there's something we don't know, I honestly can't tell. Walsh had dealt with enough complex cases to know when she needed additional resources. I'm going to request military liaison support on this one. If Mitchell really was in some kind of classified program, we need someone with the clearance to verify that. And if she wasn't, we need to understand why she's so convinced she was. The call to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service took 3 transfers and 40 minutes of explaining the situation to increasingly senior officials. Finally, Walsh found herself connected to Agent Marcus Thompson, who specialized in cases involving classified military operations. Agent Thompson, I need to understand if it's possible for someone to have served in a SEAL capacity without it showing up in standard military records. Thompson's laugh was humorless. Ms. Walsh, every few months we get calls from prosecutors or police departments asking about secret SEAL programs or classified special operations that supposedly explain why someone's military claims can't be verified. In 20 years of doing this job, exactly 0 of those claims have been legitimate. So there's no possibility? There are classified operations, sure. There are SEALs whose specific assignments might be classified. But there's no such thing as a SEAL whose existence is entirely classified. Everyone who completes SEAL training is documented. Everyone who serves in a SEAL team has records, even if the details of their missions are redacted. Walsh felt her hopes for a simple explanation fading. What about women? Is there any chance a woman could have served in SEAL capacity under some kind of experimental or classified program? Absolutely not. The integration of women into combat roles has been a highly public and political process. Every step has been documented and debated. There are no secret programs putting women into SEAL teams. After ending the call, Walsh sat back in her chair and considered her options. The evidence for prosecution was solid. Witnesses, video, and no military record to support Mitchell's claims. But something about the defendant's absolute certainty nagged at her. Most people caught in lies showed some awareness that they were being deceptive. Mitchell showed none. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Ms. Walsh, this is Agent Thompson from NCIS. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want to add something. Go ahead. While I stand by what I told you about there being no secret SEAL programs, there are aspects of special operations that are compartmentalized in ways that might not be obvious to civilian law enforcement. If you're genuinely concerned about this case, I'd recommend having someone with higher clearance review the defendant's information. Higher clearance than NCIS? There are levels of classification that even we don't have access to. If this woman really believes she served in some capacity, and she's not obviously mentally ill, it might be worth checking with Joint Special Operations Command or even higher up the chain. Walsh made a note. Can you facilitate that kind of review? I can make some calls. But, Ms. Walsh, I want to be clear, the odds of this turning up anything legitimate are essentially 0. What's more likely is that we'll waste time and resources investigating an elaborate delusion. I understand, but I'd rather be thorough than wrong. 3 days later, Walsh received a call that changed everything about the case. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and carried an authority that made her immediately pay attention. Ms. Walsh, this is Colonel Sarah Chun from the Pentagon. I understand you're prosecuting a stolen valor case involving someone claiming SEAL service. That's correct, Colonel. We've been trying to verify the defendant's claims through normal channels without success. I need you to understand something very clearly, Ms. Walsh. This conversation is classified. Are you in a secure location? Walsh's heart rate increased. In 15 years as a federal prosecutor, she'd never received a call like this. I'm in my private office. Should I be concerned about security? Standard precautions are sufficient for this conversation. Ms. Walsh, I've reviewed the file on your defendant. I cannot and will not discuss the details of her service, but I can tell you definitively that prosecuting her for stolen valor would be a serious mistake. The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't quite exploded yet. Walsh struggled to process what she was hearing. Colonel, are you telling me that Sarah Mitchell actually served as a Navy SEAL? I'm telling you that there are aspects of this case that are beyond your clearance level and beyond the scope of civilian law enforcement. The charges against Ms. Mitchell should be dropped immediately. Walsh's legal instincts kicked in. Colonel, with all due respect, I can't drop federal charges based on a phone call, even from the Pentagon. I need documentation, official statements, something I can present to a judge. That's not possible. The nature of Ms. Mitchell's service cannot be officially acknowledged or documented in any way that would be useful in civilian court. Then we have a problem because I have witnesses, video evidence, and no official record of her service. From a legal standpoint, she committed the crime she's charged with. Colonel Chun was quiet for several moments. When she spoke again, her tone was carefully measured. Ms. Walsh, I'm going to arrange for someone to speak with you in person. Someone with the authority to provide you with information that will clarify this situation. But I need your word that this conversation and any subsequent discussions will be treated as classified information. Colonel, I can't agree to classify information related to an active prosecution. That would compromise my ability to fulfill my duties as a prosecutor. Then you're going to have to trust me that dropping these charges is in everyone's best interest, including your own. Ms. Mitchell has served her country with distinction in ways that cannot be publicly acknowledged. Prosecuting her would not serve justice. It would punish someone who has already sacrificed more than you can imagine for national security. Walsh felt the case slipping away from her, transforming from straightforward prosecution into something far more complex. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to exercise your prosecutorial discretion and decline to pursue these charges. If you need a reason for your superiors, cite insufficient evidence or concerns about the witness's credibility. But do not force this case to go to trial. And if I refuse, Colonel Chin's voice carried a warning. Then you'll find yourself dealing with people much higher up the chain of command than me. People who won't ask nicely. After ending the call, Walsh sat staring at her phone for several minutes. In her career, she'd dealt with classified information, national security cases, and high-level government officials. But she'd never encountered a situation quite like this, where the very existence of someone's service was both confirmed and denied simultaneously. Her assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission. Ms. Walsh, there's a man here to see you about the Mitchell case. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says Colonel Chin sent him. The man who entered Walsh's office looked like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster for covert operations. Medium height, unremarkable features, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Everything about him suggested someone accustomed to operating in shadows. Ms. Walsh, I'm Agent Harrison. No last name, no credentials I can show you. I'm here to discuss the Sarah Mitchell situation. Walsh gestured to a chair. Agent Harrison, I've prosecuted dozens of cases involving classified information. I understand the need for security, but I also have a job to do, and that job requires evidence, documentation, and transparency in the legal process. Harrison sat down and studied her carefully. Ms. Walsh, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. Sarah Mitchell was part of a highly classified program that recruited and trained women for special operations assignments that officially don't exist. The program was so classified that even the participants' service records were kept in separate, compartmentalized systems. Why women? And why keep it so secret? Because there are certain operational environments where male operators can't gain access. Certain cultural situations where women are less likely to be suspected of being military operatives. The program was designed to fill gaps in our intelligence and special operations capabilities. Walsh made careful notes, her legal mind working through the implications. If this program existed, there must be documentation somewhere. Funding records, training records, something that would prove Mitchell's service. The documentation exists, but it's classified at levels that make it unusable in civilian court. And, Ms. Walsh, there's something else you need to understand. The program was terminated 3 years ago under circumstances that make any public acknowledgement politically impossible. What kind of circumstances? Harrison was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. The kind that involve congressional oversight, international incidents, and careers being ended at the highest levels of government. The people who approved this program are no longer in positions of authority. The people currently in charge would prefer it never existed. Walsh felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fit together. So Sarah Mitchell is caught in the middle. She served in a program that's been disavowed, with no official way to prove her service. Exactly. And prosecuting her for stolen valor would expose aspects of special operations that are still classified. It would also be a profound injustice to someone who sacrificed her entire adult life for missions she can never discuss publicly. The legal and ethical implications were staggering. Walsh had built her career on seeking justice through the proper application of law. But what was justice when the law couldn't account for the full truth of a situation? Agent Harrison, what happened to the other people in this program? Some transitioned to other classified assignments. Others left government service entirely. A few, like Ms. Mitchell, have struggled to build civilian lives while carrying secrets they can never share. It's created psychological and practical problems that the government isn't equipped to address. Walsh closed her file on the Mitchell case. What you're describing sounds like a systemic failure to support personnel who served in classified capacities. That's an accurate assessment. And prosecuting Ms. Mitchell would compound that failure by punishing her for the government's inability to properly acknowledge her service. As Harrison stood to leave, Walsh asked one final question. Is she really as qualified as she claims? Could she actually have been a SEAL? Harrison's smile was grim. Ms. Walsh, Sarah Mitchell completed training that was harder than SEAL training. She operated in environments that would challenge the most experienced Special Forces operators. If there were official recognition for what she accomplished, she'd be considered one of the most decorated soldiers of her generation. Instead, she's facing federal charges for claiming service that officially never happened. Welcome to the world of classified operations, Ms. Walsh, where the truth can be simultaneously classified and criminal to acknowledge. After Harrison left, Walsh spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing federal guidelines for prosecutorial discretion. By 5 o'clock, she had made her decision. The charges against Sarah Mitchell would be dropped, citing insufficient evidence and witness credibility concerns. But as she locked the case files away, Walsh couldn't shake the feeling that justice hadn't been served. Not for Sarah Mitchell, not for the other members of her forgotten program, and not for a system that created soldiers it couldn't acknowledge and then abandoned them to face the consequences alone. Admiral James Bull Harrison had spent 38 years in the Navy, rising through the ranks from a young ensign fresh out of Annapolis to one of the most respected flag officers in the fleet. At 59, he commanded the respect of everyone from junior enlisted sailors to Pentagon officials. His corner office at Naval Operations Headquarters in Washington, D.C. was decorated with commendations, photographs with presidents and foreign dignitaries, and mementos from deployments around the world. The call from his aide came at 0800 on a Thursday morning, interrupting his review of intelligence briefings from the Persian Gulf. Admiral, there's a situation developing in Richmond that requires your attention. A civilian has been arrested for stolen valor, claiming to be a Navy SEAL. The case has attracted attention from some unusual quarters. Admiral Harrison set down his coffee cup, already feeling the familiar tension that accompanied complex problems. Define unusual quarters, Commander. Pentagon Legal, NCS, Joint Special Operations Command, and at least 3 agencies I can't identify are all asking questions about this case. The defendant is a woman named Sarah Mitchell. The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. For a moment, the carefully controlled mask he'd worn for decades slipped, revealing the shock and pain beneath. Sarah Mitchell, a name he'd tried to forget for 3 years, a name connected to decisions that still haunted his sleep. Admiral, are you all right, sir? Harrison composed himself quickly, his voice returning to its normal professional tone. Send me everything you have on this case immediately. And, Commander, I want a secure line to Richmond within the hour. Yes, sir. Should I notify your staff that you'll be delayed for your 1000 briefing? Cancel it. Cancel everything until further notice. After his aide left, Harrison sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the Potomac River. 3 years ago, he had made what he believed was the right decision under impossible circumstances. Today, it seemed like that decision was coming back to haunt him. The files arrived 20 minutes later, delivered by courier in a locked briefcase. As Harrison read through the police reports, witness statements, and prosecutor's notes, he felt the weight of command decisions that had shaped and destroyed lives. Sarah Mitchell's arrest wasn't just a legal problem. It was a reckoning with choices he'd made at the highest levels of military command. The secure call to federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh connected at exactly 1030 hours. Ms. Walsh, this is Admiral Harrison. I understand you're handling a stolen valor case involving Sarah Mitchell. Admiral, I've already received calls from several military officials about this case. The charges have been dropped due to insufficient evidence. Harrison felt a moment of relief, followed immediately by concern. Ms. Walsh, I need to understand exactly what happened and who was involved in the decision to drop charges. I received guidance from Pentagon officials that prosecuting Ms. Mitchell would not be in the interests of national security. An Agent Harrison, no relation to you, I assume, provided background information that clarified the situation. Admiral Harrison's jaw tightened. Agent Harrison was a CIA operative who specialized in managing situations that threatened to expose classified operations. His involvement meant the case had attracted attention at the highest levels of the intelligence community. Ms. Walsh, I need to ask you to keep our conversation confidential. What I'm about to tell you is classified, but you deserve to understand the full scope of what you've been dealing with. I am listening, Admiral. Sarah Mitchell was part of a program I initiated 4 years ago. A program that trained women for deep cover special operations in environments where traditional male operators couldn't be effective. The program was highly classified, highly successful, and ultimately terminated due to political considerations beyond my control. Walsh's voice carried the weariness of someone who had spent too many days dealing with classified complications. Admiral, why wasn't this information available earlier? Why did Ms. Mitchell have to sit in jail while we sorted through layers of classification? It was the question Harrison had been dreading, the question that cut to the heart of his own failures as a commanding officer. Because, Ms. Walsh, when we terminated the program, we made a decision to essentially erase it from official records. We thought we were protecting national security and the operatives involved. Instead, we abandoned people who had served with distinction, leaving them with no way to prove their service or access the benefits they'd earned. The silence on the line stretched for several seconds before Walsh responded. Admiral, that sounds like a systemic betrayal of military personnel. You're not wrong, Ms. Walsh. And Sarah Mitchell paid the price for our failure. After ending the call with Walsh, Harrison sat in his office for an hour, wrestling with a decision that would define the remainder of his career. Finally, he picked up his secure phone and placed a call that would change everything. This is Admiral Harrison. I need to speak with Sarah Mitchell. Today. The meeting was arranged for 1,500 hours at a secure facility in Quantico, Virginia. Harrison arrived early, pacing the small conference room while he waited. When Sarah Mitchell entered, escorted by two military police officers, Harrison felt the full weight of his command decisions settle on his shoulders. Sarah had aged in the 3 years since he'd last seen her. The confident young operator who had excelled in the most challenging training programs the military could devise had been replaced by a woman carrying invisible scars. Her eyes held the same intelligence and determination, but there was a weariness there that spoke to battles fought on multiple fronts. "Hello, Admiral," she said quietly, taking a seat across from him at the conference table. "Sarah." He gestured for the MPs to leave them alone. "I heard about your arrest. I'm sorry it took so long to resolve." Her laugh was bitter. "Resolve? Is that what we're calling it? The charges were dropped, but nothing's actually resolved. I'm still a woman who claims military service that officially doesn't exist. I'm still carrying secrets I can't share with anyone. I'm still living a lie every single day." Harrison had commanded thousands of sailors over his career, had delivered news of combat deaths to families, had made decisions that cost lives in service of larger strategic goals. None of those experiences had prepared him for the conversation he needed to have with Sarah Mitchell. "Sarah, I need you to understand the position we were in when the program was terminated. Congressional oversight had discovered aspects of the operation that created political exposure at the highest levels. The decision was made to classify the entire program at levels that would make it essentially invisible. The decision was made to throw us away," Sarah corrected. 12 women who had dedicated years to training and operations that you said were critical to national security. When it became politically inconvenient, we ceased to exist. Harrison opened a file folder and spread several documents across the table. "Sarah, these are your actual service records. Every training program you completed, every operation you participated in, every commendation you earned. They've been classified at levels that prevent them from being used for veteran benefits, employment verification, or any other practical purpose." Sarah studied the documents, her expression unreadable. Seeing her service reduced to classified paperwork that couldn't acknowledge her sacrifices was like reading her own obituary. "What am I supposed to do with this, Admiral?" "Frame it and hang on the wall of my apartment, knowing it represents years of my life that I can never discuss with anyone." "I don't know," Harrison admitted. "That's why I asked you here, to figure out how to make this right." Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the training facilities where Marines prepared for deployments around the world. "Do you know what my life has been like for the past 3 years, Admiral? I can't maintain relationships because I can't explain gaps in my history. I can't get security clearances for jobs that match my qualifications because my service record doesn't exist. I drink alone in bars and listen to fake soldiers brag about service they never had while I sit there knowing I can't claim service I actually did have." The pain in her voice cut through Harrison's professional composure. "Sarah, what do you want from me? What would constitute making this right?" She turned back to face him, and Harrison saw something in her expression that made him instinctively straighten, the look of an operator who had made a critical decision. "I want you to look at this," she said, pulling off her shirt to reveal a sports bra and, more importantly, the tattoo on her left shoulder blade. Harrison's breath caught. The tattoo was a perfect reproduction of the Navy SEAL trident, but with modifications that marked it as belonging to Sarah's classified program. Small details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the operation would recognize, stars that represented specific missions, dates that corresponded to classified operations, symbols that told the story of service that officially never happened. "Jesus, Sarah, you got the program insignia tattooed." 2 days after we were told the program was being terminated and our service would be classified beyond recognition, 12 of us got the same tattoo in the same place. We figured if we couldn't officially exist, we'd at least have something permanent that proved to ourselves what we'd accomplished. Harrison stared at the tattoo, recognizing mission markers and operation codes that brought back memories of briefings in secure facilities, of operations that had prevented terrorist attacks and saved American lives. Sarah's tattoo was a chronicle of classified heroism that could never be officially acknowledged. "Sarah, this tattoo could be considered a security violation. If the wrong people saw it and recognized what it represented, what are they going to do, Admiral? Court-martial me? I don't officially exist in military records. Prosecute me for stolen valor? We just went through that. The tattoo is the only proof I have that I'm not losing my mind, that the past 8 years of my life actually happened. Harrison sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every year of his age. What do you want from me, Sarah? I can't change the classification levels. I can't publicly acknowledge the program. I can't give you the recognition you deserve without compromising ongoing operations and violating classification protocols that are above my authority level. Sarah put her shirt back on and sat down across from him again. I want you to answer one question honestly, Admiral. Do you believe the program was worth it? Do you believe what we accomplished justified what it cost us? It was a question Harrison had asked himself every day for 3 years. The operations Sarah's unit had conducted had prevented dozens of terrorist attacks, had gathered intelligence that saved American lives, had accomplished objectives that traditional special operations couldn't have achieved. But the human cost had been enormous. 12 women whose service could never be acknowledged, whose sacrifices had been erased by classification protocols. Tactically and strategically, yes. The program was extraordinarily successful. You and your teammates accomplished things that helped keep this country safe. And personally, was it worth what it cost us? Harrison met her eyes, seeing the young operator who had volunteered for an experimental program that promised to be the most challenging military service imaginable. No, Sarah, what we did to you and your teammates afterward wasn't worth any strategic objective. For the first time since entering the room, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. That's all I wanted to hear, Admiral. An acknowledgement that our service mattered, even if it can't be officially recognized. Harrison opened another folder and pulled out a document that had taken him hours of political maneuvering to obtain. Sarah, this is a presidential unit citation for your team service. It's classified at the highest levels. It can't be publicly displayed or discussed, and it will never appear in any official records. But it's real recognition from the highest levels of government for what you accomplished. Sarah read the citation, her eyes taking in language that praised extraordinary service and exceptional courage in operations that would remain forever classified. It was official recognition that she could never share with anyone, but it was recognition nonetheless. There's something else, Harrison continued. Full disability benefits based on your actual service record, backdated to your separation date. Full GI Bill benefits. Access to VA medical care. It's not public recognition, but it's practical support for the service you gave. Sarah folded the citation carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. Thank you, Admiral. This helps. Sarah, I have one more question. The program may be terminated, but your expertise, your training, your capabilities, there are other ways to serve, other programs that could use someone with your background. Sarah shook her head. I'm done, Admiral. 8 years of my life disappeared into classification levels, and I barely survived the transition back to civilian life. I won't risk losing myself in the shadows again. As their meeting concluded, Harrison watched Sarah prepare to leave. She moved with the efficient grace of someone whose military training would never fade. But she also carried the invisible wounds of someone whose service had come at an extraordinary personal cost. Sarah, one last thing. The tattoo. Be careful who sees it. There are people who would recognize what it represents, and not all of them have your best interests at heart. She paused at the door. Admiral, that tattoo isn't a security risk. It's a promise I made to myself and my teammates that our service would be remembered, even if it's only by us. Sometimes that's enough. After Sarah left, Admiral Harrison remained in the conference room for another hour, reviewing the classified files that documented one of the most successful and morally complex programs he'd ever overseen. The program had accomplished its objectives, but at a cost that kept him awake at night. Later that evening, in his private study at home, Harrison opened a secure communication channel and began typing a message that would be distributed to a small, select group of senior military leaders. Subject: Lessons learned from classified personnel programs, the recent civilian legal issues involving a former member of a classified special operations program highlight systematic failures and how we transition personnel from highly classified assignments to civilian life. We have created a generation of operators whose service cannot be acknowledged, whose expertise cannot be properly utilized, and whose sacrifices remain invisible to the nation they protected. This represents not just a policy failure, but a moral failure. We cannot continue to ask personnel to serve in capacities that we are unwilling to acknowledge or support. The classification protocols that protect national security must be balanced against our obligations to the people who carry out these missions. I am requesting a full review of transition procedures for personnel involved in compartmentalized special operations programs, with particular attention to long-term support and recognition issues. We can do better. We must do better. As Harrison sent the message, he knew it would trigger uncomfortable conversations in the Pentagon and the intelligence community. But Sarah Mitchell's arrest had forced him to confront the human cost of the decisions made in secure briefing rooms, and he could no longer justify silence in the face of that cost. The tattoo on Sarah's shoulder might be invisible to the world, but it represented service that demanded recognition, even if that recognition had to remain forever classified. 6 months after her arrest, Sarah Mitchell sat in the waiting room of the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Richmond, holding paperwork that shouldn't have existed. The documents in her folder were marked with classification stamps and contained medical records that referenced training injuries, combat stress, and service-connected disabilities that officially had never occurred. Dr. Amanda Roberts, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating veterans with PTSD from classified operations, had been briefed on Sarah's case through channels that bypassed normal VA procedures. When Sarah entered her office, Dr. Roberts saw immediately what she'd learned to recognize in operators who had served in programs that couldn't be acknowledged, the careful control that came from years of keeping deadly secrets, and the exhaustion that came from living a life built on necessary lies. Sarah, I understand you've been having difficulty transitioning to civilian life, Dr. Roberts began, settling into her chair across from the worn couch where Sarah sat rigidly upright. That's one way to put it. Sarah's voice carried the dry humor that had helped her survive 8 years in an experimental program that pushed human capabilities to their limits. It's hard to explain gaps in your resume when those gaps involve operations that officially never happened. Dr. Roberts had treated dozens of veterans whose service had been partially or completely classified. She understood the unique psychological challenges that came from being unable to share the experiences that had defined their adult lives. But Sarah's case was extreme even by those standards. Tell me about the arrest. How did that affect you? Sarah was quiet for several moments, staring at a spot on the wall behind Dr. Roberts' head. It was almost a relief, if I'm being honest. For the first time in 3 years, I could tell the truth about who I was, even if no one believed me. But they didn't believe you. No, and I can't blame them. Officially, what I claimed was impossible. Women aren't allowed in SEAL teams. There are no secret programs. The people who trained me, who commanded me, who sent me on operations that saved American lives, none of them could or would acknowledge that I existed. Dr. Roberts made careful notes, aware that even this conversation was walking the line of classification protocols. Sarah, can you tell me about the tattoo? The one that caused so much attention. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her left shoulder. It was our way of making sure we remembered. 12 women who had given everything to a program that was erased from official records. We got matching tattoos, each one customized with our individual service markers. Service markers, operations, training milestones, combat decorations. Everything that would normally be on a service record, but translated into symbols that only we would understand. My tattoo tells the story of 8 years that officially never happened. Dr. Roberts understood the psychological importance of the tattoo. For veterans whose service couldn't be acknowledged, physical reminders became crucial anchors to identity and purpose. What did it mean to you when Admiral Harrison recognized the tattoo? For the first time since entering the office, Sarah's carefully controlled expression shifted. Pain, relief, and something approaching gratitude flickered across her features. It meant that at least one person in a position of authority remembered what we had done. That our service wasn't just a shared delusion among 12 women who couldn't prove we'd ever served our country. But it didn't solve the fundamental problem. No, I still can't put my real military experience on job applications. I still can't explain to friends or romantic partners what I did for 8 years. I still wake up from nightmares about operations I can never discuss with anyone. Dr. Roberts had seen the medical records that documented Sarah's service-related injuries and trauma, training accidents that had left her with chronic pain in her left knee and right shoulder, combat stress from operations in environments that would challenge the most experienced special forces operators, the psychological impact of living deep cover identities for months at a time, essentially becoming different people to accomplish mission objectives. Sarah, what's the hardest part of your current situation? Sarah considered the question carefully. The isolation. When you serve in regular military units, you have battle buddies, people who understand what you've been through. When you get out, you have veteran communities, people who share similar experiences. But when your service is completely classified, you're alone with experiences that no one else can understand or validate. What about the other women from your program? We're not supposed to contact each other. It's a security protocol. Gathering together would create a risk of exposure. Sarah's voice carried bitter irony. So we're not only isolated from civilian society and normal veteran communities, we're isolated from the only people who could truly understand what we went through. Dr. Roberts recognized the systematic nature of the problems Sarah faced. It wasn't just individual trauma or adjustment issues. It was the psychological impact of being erased from official recognition while being expected to reintegrate into a society that couldn't acknowledge their sacrifices. Sarah, I want to try something different. I've been working with a small group of therapists who specialize in treating veterans from highly classified programs. We've developed support structures that work within security protocols while providing the community connection that's essential for psychological health. What kind of support structures? Support groups where participants don't discuss specific operations or programs, but focus on the common psychological challenges of transitioning from classified service. Individual therapy that addresses service-related trauma without requiring disclosure of classified information. And advocacy for better policies regarding veterans whose service cannot be publicly acknowledged. For the first time since her arrest, Sarah felt something approaching hope. Would I be able to connect with others who've been through similar situations? Yes, though not necessarily others from your specific program. There are more veterans dealing with classified service issues than you might think. Different programs, different time periods, but similar psychological challenges. Dr. Roberts opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. Sarah, I've also been working with VA administrators and Pentagon officials to develop better procedures for supporting veterans whose service is classified. Your arrest became a catalyst for examining how the system has been failing people in your situation. What kind of changes? Streamline procedures for accessing benefits based on classified service records. Medical care that acknowledges service-related injuries without requiring disclosure of how those injuries occurred. Employment assistance that helps veterans find work that utilizes their skills without compromising security. Sarah read through the documents Dr. Roberts had given her, seeing policy changes that could have transformed her post-service experience if they had been in place 3 years earlier. This would help a lot of people. That's the goal. Your case highlighted systematic problems that go far beyond individual adjustment issues. The military has been creating highly trained personnel and then abandoning them when their service becomes politically inconvenient. After her appointment with Dr. Roberts, Sarah drove to a small park overlooking the James River. She sat on a bench and pulled out her phone, staring at a contact she hadn't called in over a year. Finally, she pressed the number. This is Marcus. Marcus, it's Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. Marcus Thompson was her former team leader, the only person from her program who had successfully transitioned to other classified assignments after termination. He was also the closest thing to family she had left from her 8 years in service. Sara, Jesus, are you okay? I heard about the arrest. I am okay. The charges were dropped. But, Marcus, I've been thinking about something Dr. Roberts said about security protocols and isolation. What about them? She said we're not supposed to contact each other because gathering together would create exposure risks. But, Marcus, we're already exposed. My arrest proved that. The program's existence has been acknowledged at levels that compromise security anyway. Marcus was quiet, and Sarah could almost hear him thinking through the security implications. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to stop being more concerned about protecting a program that's already been exposed than about taking care of the people who served in it. Sarah, you're talking about violating direct orders regarding contact protocols. I'm talking about survival. Marcus, I nearly didn't make it through the past 3 years. The isolation, the inability to process what we went through, the complete lack of support from the military that trained us, it almost killed me. And I know I'm not the only one struggling. Marcus's voice carried the weight of similar struggles. 2 of our teammates have attempted suicide in the past 2 years. Another one has been arrested twice for fights in bars, trying to prove something to people who will never understand what she's accomplished. Then, we have to do something. The system failed us, Marcus. The program was terminated to protect political careers, and we were classified out of existence to avoid uncomfortable questions. But we're still here, and we still need support. What do you want to do? Sarah looked out at the river, watching boats navigate the current. I want to organize a reunion. All 12 of us, together for the first time since termination. Not to discuss classified operations or compromise security, but to support each other as veterans who share an experience that no one else can understand. Sarah, that could end whatever career some of us still have in government service. And continuing to suffer in isolation could end our lives. Marcus, we gave 8 years to a program that accomplished incredible things. We prevented terrorist attacks, gathered intelligence that saved American lives, and operated in environments that traditional forces couldn't access. Don't we deserve better than being abandoned to deal with the aftermath alone? Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice carried the decision-making tone Sarah remembered from their operational days. Where and when? I'll send details through secure channels. And Marcus, thank you for being willing to risk your career to help your teammates. Sarah, you once carried me 3 miles through enemy territory with a broken leg. The least I can do is risk a security review to make sure you don't face this fight alone. After ending the call, Sarah began composing a message that would be sent through encrypted channels to 11 women scattered across the country. Women who had served together in a program that officially didn't exist, who had been classified out of recognition, and who had spent 3 years trying to rebuild their lives while carrying secrets that isolated them from normal human connection. The message was simple. The reunion you never knew you needed is happening. It's time to take care of each other, since no one else will. 3 weeks later, 12 women gathered at a remote cabin in the Virginia mountains. They had aged in different ways since their service ended. Some had found successful civilian careers. Others had struggled with unemployment and underemployment. Some had married and started families. Others had found intimate relationships impossible to maintain while carrying unshakable secrets. But when they saw each other again, the years fell away. These were the people who had shared the most intense training the military could devise, who had operated together in environments that would challenge the most experienced Special Forces personnel, who had formed bonds that transcended normal human connection. Sarah stood before the group, looking at faces that had been with her through experiences that officially never happened. I know we're violating security protocols by being here together. I know some of you are risking careers and clearances, but I also know that we're survivors, and survivors take care of each other. Lisa Chun, who had been the team's communication specialist, spoke first. Sarah, when you were arrested, it forced all of us to confront what our lives have become. Living lies, carrying secrets, isolated from the communities that could understand what we've been through. This reunion isn't just about nostalgia, it's about survival. Jennifer Martinez, the team's medic, had been struggling with alcoholism since leaving the program. I've been to VA counselors who can't understand why I have combat stress, while my official record shows I never serve in combat zones. I've been to civilian therapists who think I'm delusional when I can't explain gaps in my history. This is the first time in 3 years I've been able to talk honestly about what I've been going through. As the day progressed, the 12 women shared their struggles and successes, their attempts to build civilian lives while carrying the invisible weight of classified service. They discovered that their experiences, while individual, followed similar patterns: isolation, difficulty maintaining relationships, employment challenges, and the psychological impact of being erased from official recognition. But they also discovered something else, that together they were stronger than the system that had abandoned them. They began planning support networks that would work within security protocols while providing the community connection essential for psychological health. They discussed advocacy efforts that could improve policies for future veterans facing similar situations. They committed to maintaining contact through secure channels, ensuring that none of them would face their post-service challenges alone. At the end of the day, Sarah stood on the cabin's porch, looking out at the mountains. Lisa joined her, both women quiet in the comfortable silence that came from shared understanding. "Sarah, do you ever regret volunteering for the program?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret how it ended. I regret the classification decisions that erased our service from recognition. I regret the 3 years of isolation and struggle that followed. But the program itself, the operations we conducted, the lives we saved, the capabilities we developed, no, I don't regret that, even knowing what it cost us. Lisa, we volunteered for something unprecedented. We became the first women to serve in direct action special operations roles. We proved that women could excel in the most challenging military assignments. The fact that our service was later classified out of existence doesn't change what we accomplished." Lisa nodded, understanding. The tattoo was the right call. Physical proof that what we did was real, even if official recognition was taken away. Sarah touched her left shoulder, feeling the outline of the trident tattoo beneath her shirt. "Sometimes I think that tattoo is the most honest thing about my life. Everything else has been shaped by classification protocols and security requirements, but that tattoo tells the truth about who I am and what I've done." As the sun set over the Virginia mountains, 12 women who had served in a program that officially didn't exist sat together on a cabin porch, sharing stories they couldn't tell anyone else and finding healing in community they had been denied for 3 years. The program might have been terminated and classified out of recognition, but the bonds forged in service couldn't be erased by policy decisions or security protocols. For the first time since their service ended, they weren't alone with their secrets. The next morning, as they prepared to return to their separate lives, Sarah made one final address to the group. "What we've built here this weekend, this support network, this commitment to each other, this is how we honor our service. Not through official recognition that may never come, but through taking care of each other and ensuring that our sacrifices weren't in vain." The 12 women left the cabin carrying something they hadn't had in 3 years. The certainty that their service had been real, their sacrifices had mattered, and they weren't alone in carrying the weight of classified heroism. The tattoos on their shoulders might be invisible to the world, but they had found a community that understood what those tattoos represented. Service that demanded recognition, even if that recognition had to remain forever private. 2 years after the reunion in the Virginia mountains, Sarah Mitchell stood before a congressional subcommittee in a secure hearing room deep beneath the Capitol building. The room was soundproof, electronically secured, and cleared for discussions that would never appear in public records. Around the table sat 12 senators and representatives who held the highest security clearances in Congress, along with senior officials from the Pentagon, CIA, and other agencies whose very presence in the room was classified. Chairman Senator Patricia Williams, a former Army colonel who understood military culture, called the hearing to order. This classified session is convened to examine the treatment of personnel involved in highly classified special operations programs, with particular focus on transition support and recognition issues. Sarah sat at the witness table, wearing her only formal suit and carrying a folder containing documents that told the story of service that officially didn't exist. Beside her sat Admiral Harrison, whose message 2 years earlier had triggered the investigation that led to this moment. "Ms. Mitchell," Senator Williams began, "you understand that your testimony today is classified and cannot be discussed outside this secured environment?" "Yes, ma'am. Please tell the committee about your military service and the challenges you've faced since leaving that service." Sarah had rehearsed this moment for weeks, knowing it represented not just her own story, but the experiences of hundreds of other veterans whose service had been classified beyond recognition. "Senators, I served for 8 years in a program that trained women for special operations assignments in environments where traditional male operators couldn't be effective. The program was highly successful tactically, but when it was terminated for political reasons, those of us who served in it found ourselves in an impossible situation." Congressman Michael Torres, a former Marine, leaned forward. "Impossible how?" "Our service records were classified at levels that made them unusable for veteran benefits, employment verification, or any practical purpose. We couldn't access VA medical care for service-related injuries because officially we had never served in combat roles. We couldn't find employment that utilized our extensive training because we couldn't document our qualifications. We couldn't maintain normal relationships because we couldn't explain fundamental aspects of our identities." Senator Williams made careful notes. "Ms. Mitchell, what was the psychological impact of this situation?" "Ma'am, it created a form of psychological torture. We had given our entire adult lives to serving our country, had accomplished missions that saved American lives, and had developed capabilities that represented millions of dollars in training investment. But we were expected to reintegrate into civilian society as if those experiences had never happened." Admiral Harrison spoke for the first time. "Chairman Williams, if I may add context, the women in this program completed training that was more challenging than SEAL training. They operated in environments that would challenge the most experienced Special Forces operators. Their service record, if it could be publicly acknowledged, would mark them among the most decorated soldiers of their generation." Congressman Torres looked skeptical. "Admiral, if these operations were so successful, why was the program terminated?" Admiral Harrison's expression was grim. "Politics, Congressman. The program was discovered during a broader investigation into special operations activities. Rather than defend the program's achievements, senior leadership chose to terminate it to avoid political controversy." Senator Williams turned back to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, tell us about your arrest and how that situation was resolved." Sarah described the night in Murphy's Tavern, the arrest for stolen valor, and the complex process of getting charges dropped without official acknowledgement of her service. The arrest forced multiple government agencies to confront a fundamental contradiction. We had trained personnel whose service was so classified that they couldn't prove it existed, but who were legally vulnerable to prosecution if they ever claimed that service. And the tattoo that ultimately led to recognition of your service? Sarah touched her left shoulder unconsciously. The tattoo was our way of ensuring that our service would be remembered, even if it couldn't be officially acknowledged. It contains symbols and markers that document our training and operations in a form that only we could understand. Congressman James Reed, who had been silent throughout the hearing, finally spoke. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm struggling to understand how this situation was allowed to develop. How does the military train personnel for years, deploy them on critical operations, and then abandon them without support?" "Sir, respectfully, it happened because the classification system prioritized political protection over personnel welfare. When the program became politically inconvenient, we were classified out of existence rather than properly transitioned to civilian life or other assignments." Admiral Harrison added, "Congressman Reed, this case represents a systematic failure in how we handle personnel who serve in highly classified capacities. We've created policies that protect operations and officials, but that abandon the individuals who carry out those operations. Senator Williams looked around the table at her colleagues. What we're hearing describes a fundamental breach of the military's obligation to its personnel. Admiral Harrison, what changes have been implemented since this situation came to light? Chairman Williams, we've developed new protocols for transitioning personnel from highly classified assignments. These include maintaining unclassified service records that document general qualifications without compromising specific operations. We've created support structures within the VA that can provide benefits and medical care based on classified service records. And we've established advocacy positions to ensure that personnel in similar situations have institutional support. Sarah leaned forward. Senators, those changes will help future personnel, but they don't address the hundreds of veterans who are currently dealing with similar situations. People who serve in programs across different time periods and different agencies who are struggling with the same challenges I faced. Congressman Torres asked, "What do you propose?" I propose a comprehensive review and remedy program for veterans whose service has been classified beyond recognition. Expedited access to benefits based on classified service records. Employment assistance that acknowledges their actual qualifications. Medical care that addresses service-related conditions without requiring disclosure of classified information. And, most importantly, some form of recognition that acknowledges their sacrifices, even if that recognition has to remain classified. Senator Williams made extensive notes. Ms. Mitchell, you mentioned that there were 12 women in your program. Are they facing similar challenges? Yes, ma'am. And through our efforts to support each other, we've discovered that this problem extends far beyond our specific program. There are hundreds of veterans from different classified operations who are dealing with similar issues. Admiral Harrison nodded. Chairman Williams, Ms. Mitchell's case became a catalyst for identifying what appears to be a widespread problem affecting personnel who served in compartmentalized special operations across multiple decades. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with committee members asking detailed questions about classification policies, transition procedures, and the long-term impact of serving in programs that couldn't be officially acknowledged. At the conclusion, Senator Williams made a statement that would change the lives of hundreds of veterans. Based on the testimony we've heard today, this committee will recommend the creation of a classified service recognition and support program. This program will provide comprehensive support for veterans whose service has been classified beyond traditional recognition, ensuring that their sacrifices are acknowledged and their transition to civilian life is properly supported. 6 months later, Sarah received a phone call that brought her full circle from the night she was arrested in Murphy's Tavern. Sarah, this is Dr. Roberts. I wanted to let you know that the VA has approved your application to become a peer counselor in the new Classified Service Support Program. Sarah felt emotion she hadn't expected. Dr. Roberts, when I was arrested 2 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything. My identity, my purpose, my connection to the service that had defined my adult life. And now I have a chance to help other veterans who are dealing with what I went through, to make sure they don't face those challenges alone. The new position would allow Sarah to use her experience to support other veterans whose service couldn't be publicly acknowledged. She would help them navigate the complex process of accessing benefits based on classified service records, connect them with support communities that understood their unique challenges, and advocate for policies that better supported personnel transitioning from highly classified assignments. On her first day in a new position, Sarah sat in an office at the VA Medical Center, waiting for her first client. When the door opened, a young man in his late 20s entered, carrying the same careful composure Sarah recognized in herself and her teammates, the controlled demeanor of someone carrying secrets that isolated them from normal human connection. "I'm Tom Rodriguez," he said, taking a seat across from her desk. "I was told you might be able to help me with some issues related to classified service." Sarah smiled, recognizing the careful language veterans learned to use when discussing service that couldn't be officially acknowledged. "Tom, I'm Sarah Mitchell, and yes, I can help. But First, let me ask you something. Do you have trouble explaining gaps in your resume to potential employers? Tom's expression showed surprise and relief. Yes, exactly. How did you know? Because I've been where you are. I've dealt with the isolation, the inability to explain fundamental aspects of my identity, the challenges of building a civilian life while carrying experiences that officially never happened. You were in a classified program? For 8 years. And Tom, the first thing I want you to understand is that you're not alone anymore. There are hundreds of us from different programs and different time periods, but all dealing with similar challenges. And now there are systems in place to help. As Sarah began her first counseling session in her new role, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The arrest that had seemed like a catastrophe had actually been the catalyst for changes that would help hundreds of veterans. The tattoo that had marked her as impossible had become the symbol of service that demanded recognition, even if that recognition had to remain classified. Later that afternoon, Sarah drove to Arlington National Cemetery. She walked through Section 60, where many of the newest military casualties were buried, reading names and dates that told stories of service and sacrifice. At one gravestone, she stopped and knelt down. The name on the stone was Lisa Chun, her former teammate and the communications specialist who had struggled with depression after leaving their classified program. Lisa had taken her own life 6 months before the congressional hearing, unable to cope with the isolation and lack of support for her service-related trauma. Sarah placed a small American flag beside the gravestone and spoke quietly. "Lisa, we did it. We got the support systems established. We made sure other veterans won't have to face what we faced alone. Your sacrifice wasn't in vain." As she walked back through the cemetery, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Thompson, her former team leader who now worked as a liaison between classified programs and the new support systems they had helped create. "Sarah, just wanted you to know, we got approval for the memorial. It's going to be classified. It won't be open to the public, but there will finally be official recognition of our program and the sacrifices made by our teammates." Sarah felt tears she rarely allowed herself to shed. A classified memorial was better than no memorial at all. It was acknowledgement that their service had been real, their sacrifices had mattered, and their teammates who hadn't survived the transition to civilian life would be remembered. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment, looking at the Presidential Unit citation that Admiral Harrison had given her 2 years earlier. Beside it on her desk was a new document, her official VA identification card, which listed her as a counselor in the Classified Service Support Program. She pulled off her shirt and looked in the mirror at the tattoo on her left shoulder blade. The Navy SEAL trident with its modified symbols still told the story of 8 years that officially hadn't happened. But now those 8 years had led to something positive, a program that would ensure other veterans with similar experiences wouldn't face their challenges alone. The tattoo that had once been evidence of impossible service had become the foundation for a support system that acknowledged service that couldn't be publicly recognized. It had taken an arrest, a congressional hearing, and years of advocacy, but finally, there was institutional recognition that classification protocols couldn't be allowed to abandon the people who served in classified capacities. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her reflection. The caller ID showed a number from the Pentagon. "Sarah, this is Admiral Harrison. I want to let you know that we're implementing similar support programs across all branches of the military. Your case has become the model for how we handle personnel transitioning from highly classified assignments. Admiral, when this all started with my arrest, I never imagined it would lead to systematic changes. Sarah, sometimes it takes one person's courage to expose institutional failures that affect hundreds of others. Your willingness to fight for recognition of your service, even when that recognition had to remain classified, has created support systems that will help veterans for decades to come." After ending the call, Sarah returned to her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had sat in Murphy's Tavern 3 years earlier, drinking alone and unable to share the experiences that had defined her life. This woman had purpose beyond her own survival. She had become an advocate for others who carried similar invisible burdens. The tattoo on her shoulder remained the same, but its meaning had evolved. It was no longer just proof of service that couldn't be acknowledged. It had become a symbol of a movement that ensured no veteran would be classified out of recognition and support. At 37, Sarah Mitchell had found her post-service mission, ensuring that the system that had abandoned her and her teammates would never abandon another veteran. The program that had trained her for 8 years in the most challenging military assignments had ultimately prepared her for the most important mission of her life, taking care of the people who had given everything to serve their country in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged. The secret warriors would no longer fight their battles alone. The tattoo that had once marked impossible service had become the foundation for a support system that recognized the possible within the classified, the heroic within the hidden, and the community within the isolation of necessary secrets. In the end, Sarah's arrest for stolen valor had led to something neither the prosecutors nor the military officials had expected. Not the punishment of someone falsely claiming service, but the creation of systems to properly support those whose real service had been classified beyond recognition. The truth, when it finally emerged, had been more extraordinary than any lie, and more important than any individual case. The Admiral had indeed gone speechless when he saw the tattoo, but not from shock, from recognition of service that demanded acknowledgement, sacrifice that deserved support, and heroism that could finally, even if quietly, be honored.